r/Ask Reddit. Serious, scientists of Reddit. What's craziest or weirdest thing in your field that you suspect is true but is not yet supported fully by data? Story 1. Darwin's Dilemma refers to the absence of known macroscopic fossils, i.e. executing microbial stuff, from beneath the base of the Cambrian period, i.e. older than 541 million years, when he was first describing his theory of evolution. Everyone, including Darwin, expected that when fossils were found from before the Cambrian period that they would be the ancestors of modern animals. Then when those fossils were found, Ediacara biota we call them, after the Ediacara Hills in South Australia, they were enthusiastically classified as ancient jellyfish, ancient worms, etc. But it turns out that's a load of crap. Consensus is growing that almost none of those classifications were accurate. Instead, most Ediacaran organisms seem to have belonged to extinct groups unrelated to anything alive today, and they lived in a world that was so different from the following 540 million years. They had modes of life distinct from any living macroscopic organisms. We were so eager to make everything fit into our neat little evolutionary narrative that for decades we basically glossed over these crazy, alien sort of ecosystems that could be critical to understanding the origins of complex life on other planets as well as our own. We're still just beginning to really understand it though. It's a very controversial field of paleontology. Story 2. We will, eventually, be able to efficiently design enzymes to conduct complicated chemical transformations that would be otherwise impossible on unmodified substrates. A 2008 science paper, David Baker, Ken Houck, Forrest Michael, and a bunch of other awesome scientists, showed proof of principle in designing a deoxyribonucleic enzyme in silico. They designed the necessary transition state and the protein sequence that would form the corresponding active site, built the protein, and it catalyzed the exact reaction they intended to catalyze. It's beautiful work, and they've done a lot of incredible things since then. Scott Miller's group at Yale has done similar things using much smaller peptide catalysts to do site-specific modifications of things like vancomycin, which is a huge antibiotic, in a very selective manner. What does this mean? Taking for example the development of antibiotics, we're running into problems of resistance. Bugs are developing immunity to existing antibiotics. Even our last resorts, like vancomycin, are starting to fail. We can bypass these resistance mechanisms by modifying the antibiotics at certain positions, but this can be an incredibly difficult process. If we could design protein catalysts to promote the desired reaction on the unmodified antibiotic in a highly selective manner, we can make libraries of antibiotics efficiently that can tide us over until we develop some other manner of treating infections. Story 3. There is ongoing discussion on the neurological and neurobiological correlates to depression. Psychiatry has focused on neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, because most antidepressants have effects on these transmitter systems and seem to help the patients over the course of many weeks. SSRIs take at least 3 weeks to show measurable, non-placebo effects in patients. But as a matter of fact, we still do not know why. A German psychiatrist now proposed a new model for depression, explaining it with a chronic overdose of cortisol, a hormone closely associated with stress. He was even able to treat patients with a cortisol antagonist successfully, and within hours of treatment. Very short explanation of the theory, actually. His work has not been acknowledged very much until now, but I wouldn't be surprised if there is something true to it. Story 4. A little late to the game on this one, and I'm not exactly a scientist, but here's my weird fact that may be true, although is based on tenuous evidence. What we've found definitively in anthropological studies of cultures with a strong oral tradition, the one I'm familiar with is studies of peoples in the Balkans, is that oral memory is a lot better in other cultures that rely less on writing. That, for instance, is why the Iliad and Odyssey could be passed down by oral tradition for centuries before they were written down, relatively intact. As a result of this, some scholars have made the case that the date of the fall of Troy is preserved in the Iliad and Odyssey, based on their descriptions of astronomical phenomena, some of which are more dubious readings than others. The date given by the astronomical dating lines up with the date archaeologists have determined for the destruction of Troy VI, which the consensus of scholars accepts to be the Homeric Troy. Story 5. Neuroscience. Here paraplegia/quadriplegia are solved problems. We are already very good at recognizing patterns of activity measured through EEG or other, relatively, non-invasive recording methods in real time and using this data to control various simple machines. The next step is expanding the scale so that, instead of controlling a computer mouse, a paralyzed individual controls legs or arms fluidly. Currently, the most well-known researcher adapting this technology to allowing paralyzed people to walk and move is Miguel Nicolelis, who plans to construct an exoskeleton to allow a paralyzed person to kick a soccer ball at the World Cup. Soon, very soon, we will be able to make this feasible for real-world application. Beyond that, the entire field of brain-machine interface is booming. It is a natural adaptation of where neuroscience is, because it is not simple, but relatively so. Need to be able to recognize recurring patterns you observe when an individual thinks or does something to be able to use those patterns to control machines. It's a fancy trick to allow thought control, without really understanding why or how those thoughts exist in the first place. Very cool stuff. Giving Viagra to pregnant women will help combat obesity. It is well known in science that being born small or growth restricted is strongly correlated with later obesity, hypertension, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes. These babies are ill-equipped for the calorie-rich world in which we live, and as a result their bodies preferentially store fat and essentially gobble up any glucose or fat that enters their bodies. A huge amount of the obesity we see today may be due to growth restriction. Viagra works by opening up the blood vessels in the penis to allow an erection. Viagra could similarly open up the blood vessels to the placenta and therefore the baby, providing them with more nutrients in the womb to help them grow. We're currently testing this theory in mice, rats, and sheep. Clinical trials in humans about to start. Story 7. Here are these things called Lorimer bursts in radio astronomy, the first detected only a few years ago, only 4 detections since. Basically, it's a huge burst of noise that lasts for a few milliseconds and disappears. The reason BTW these are so weird is they're huge bursts of energy, and they come from about half the visible universe away from us. This should not happen, and no one really has an idea of how these things would be generated since right now there are no models for it. Anyway, people still don't know what they are. There's some discussion that it was a weather phenomenon for a while, and one telling thing is so far only Parkes Observatory in Australia, where The Dish was filmed, has seen them, so everyone in radio astronomy is eager to be the person who spots one at a not Parkes Observatory. So my weirdest thing is these things are crazy mysterious, but I like to think they're real and from far away. What can I say? I'm a romantic who loves curve balls thrown at us in science, and we only barely have the technology to look for them. Plus, hey, it'd make a nice chapter in my thesis if I found one. Story 8. It is suspected that at least some baleen whales can echolocate to at least a rudimentary extent. This is due to several recordings of abnormal whistles produced during the rescue of several humpback whales on different occasions. Humpback whales occasionally get lost in river systems and need to be aided in getting out. Also, it is likely that bottlenose, and possibly other, dolphins are able to follow magnetic lines, a likely reason for many beachings. Currently there is some observed evidence of this, however there has not been a mechanism for this navigation that has been isolated as of yet. Not a surprise, as it takes about a dozen or so nerve cells to do this, and dolphins have over 1 trillion cells in their body. Story 9. There was a recent finding that 5 psychiatric disorders share some common genetic mutations related to voltage-gated calcium channel subunits in the brain. Voltage-gated calcium channels play a role in neurotransmitter release, which is why some medications that increase the amount of neurotransmitter in the synapse, such as SSRIs, seem to cure some psychiatric disorders for some people. This also might pose why electroconvulsive shock therapy works for some patients in treating their previously treatment-resistant depression. The shock activates the voltage-gated channels that are affected by the mutation. Psychiatry is probably one of the least understood areas of medicine. We still have no idea what truly causes mental disorders. Story 10. When personal genomic sequencing becomes readily accessible, even as a routine medical service, much like a physical, We should be able to place the data into a controlled anonymized database and use statistical analysis to essentially link most disease states and predispositions to their genotypic bases. There are loads of combinatoric black holes in the genome data right now, since we haven't been able to collect large-scale, high-throughput disease/genotype relationships on a genomic scale yet due to the expense. Have a look at the company 23andMe for an example of a smaller-scale version of this. They represent a good first step towards breaking the cost down and making personal genomics accessible regardless of socioeconomic status. Story 11. A lot of the accepted mechanisms for the way reactions occur are incomplete at best. Example: water and alkaline metals go boom. The accepted mechanism is that the metal dissolves and loses an electron which goes to an H+ to make H, which combines with another H to make H2. Then the heat causes the H2 to combust. However, recent observations of various colors associated with metal vapor evolving during the reaction suggest the metal may be vaporizing at the interface with water, and that this reaction is occurring in the gas phase rather than a simple dissolution of the solid and subsequent electron exchange. Edit. So a lot of people don't like the alkaline metal with water example, so here is a bit about my own research. I am working with a material that has been known since the 50s. It wasn't thought to be too exciting, but we understand more about the mechanism by which it forms now. We have been able to use this knowledge to add a simple compound to the mixture that actually slows the formation of the material. This has led us to creating the highest resolution photoresist in the world. Story 12. As a few other biology people have pointed out, we're now very close to being able to practically, cost-wise, sequence genomes routinely in clinical practice. A large portion of cancer research going on now is focusing on how to take that sort of information, i.e. your cancer has these 56 mutations, and develop a therapy that is specific for you. The first proof of concept drug for this type of approach, known as personalized medicine, is erlotinib, a drug that specifically shows action in patients with mutations in the EGFR gene. It's been in the clinic for several years now. In the near future, cancer physicians will have a whole suite of these sorts of targeted drugs, which work extremely well for a subset of patients while having little side effect, to give in combinations dependent on which mutations are present in your cancer. This might be a little more than 10 years out, but it is exciting and will yield positive results all along the way. Story 13. I am a student in meteorology. This is more of a technological advance than something that needs to be proven. Within the next 10 to 20 years, most cars or cell phones will have microchips in them whose sole purpose is to record the current data, such as temp, wind, etc. This will allow for millions upon millions of data points, which in turn will greatly increase the grid spacing for forecast models. In layman's terms, forecast accuracy and forecast personalization will be near pristine, down to the seconds. Microchips are already cheap enough, we just need the proper computing power to process all of that data in real time. Supercomputers to the rescue. Story 14. We are going to find a biological recipe for creating self-assembled tissues from scratch. Developmental biological processes can turn a single-celled zygote into an adult human. It's pretty damn incredible when you think about it. Somewhere buried in the complexity of metazoan biology are a set of origami-like rules that allow growing tissues to self-assemble into larger tissues and organs. If we can model and manipulate these programs with precision, we can engineer just about any tissue we like. A lot of people are familiar with 3D organ printing as a route to organ manufacturing, but I think it's a dead end without more knowledge of biological self-assembly. If we can't control how tissues develop, the organs will fall apart as soon as they are printed. The missing pieces of tissue self-assembly are quantitative models for tissue morphogenesis, which are being filled in as we speak by advances in vitro tissue culturing and molecular biology, like viruses that can measure gene activity over time with good spatial resolution. Story 15. Surgery and other actions that can aggravate the inflammatory response might be a contributing factor to neurodegenerative disorders similar to Alzheimer's. There have been some preliminary studies on stuff like this, and the data seems promising, but we have to take into account the effects of different types of anesthesia, different types of surgery, etc. Story 16. most batch-based drug manufacture will move to continuous processes over the next 20 years. It's cheaper, greener, produces more product in less time, and the quality control is much more robust. I'm currently working in the field. There are about 8 of us working on it in one of the 10 biggest drug companies in the world. Story 17. Although a species barrier exists that slows or seems to prevent altogether the spread of prion disease between species, it is likely that chronic wasting disease, CWD, a prion disease affecting deer, elk, and moose will jump to humans and/or to cattle. And then to humans. Currently, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, BSE, or mad cow disease, is the only known non-human prion disease that can be transmitted to humans, and people have stopped paying much attention to the very rare cases of variant CJD. But when CWD crosses the species barrier, the shit will hit the fan. And due to the length of the incubation period in humans, on the order of years, it is my guess that patient 0 has already consumed CWD-infected deer, and either isn't showing clinical symptoms yet, or is showing symptoms that are being incorrectly diagnosed as something else.
Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe.